The smell was the first thing Rawl noticed. It was not a bad smell. It was something like warm stone after a long day in the sun, mixed with something faintly metallic, the way old coins smell when held too long in a fist. He had been working in the intake sector of Station Meridian for 3 weeks and had grown used to the smells of different species, the sharp chemical bite of the Vethori, the soft earthy musk of the Pelin refugees. But this smell was different. It sat in the back of his throat and stayed there. The Draconi hatchlings had arrived 2 days ago. Rawl stood at the edge of the quarantine wing and looked through the reinforced glass at what was inside. 17 of them. Small, most no bigger than a medium-sized dog, with folded wings pressed tight against their sides and tails curled under their bodies. Their scales ranged from pale gray to deep amber. Their eyes, when open, were gold, bright, sharp, and very afraid. Most of them weren't moving. The station's medical officer, a tall Velisi named Orath, appeared at Rawl's shoulder and said that the hatchlings had not eaten in 31 hours. She said this the way people say things they want someone else to fix. Rawl was not a doctor. He was not a diplomat. He was an aid logistics worker. He moved food, medicine, and supplies to where they needed to go, and he filled out the forms that allowed that movement to happen. He was very good at his job, and his job had nothing to do with frightened children of any species. He went in anyway. The room had a low hum to it, the ventilation system working harder than usual, because Draconi hatchlings ran warm, very warm. Their body temperature at this age was close to 50 degrees Celsius, which is why the room felt like a summer afternoon on a planet with 2 suns. Rawl immediately felt the sweat start at the back of his neck. The hatchlings flinched when he entered. Several pressed themselves further into the walls. One made a sound, a low, clicking trill, and the others went very still. Rawl stopped. He did not reach out. He did not make any sounds. He did not try to look calm in the deliberate way that people do when they are trying to project calm and actually projecting something much louder. He just stood there for a moment, reading the room the way he always read a new distribution center. Where were the bottlenecks? Where was the stress? Where was the thing most likely to break? The answer was easy. In the far back corner, behind a cluster of 3 other hatchlings who had pressed themselves into a kind of pile, there was one who had separated from the others entirely. She was smaller than the rest. Her scales were the color of old ash pale gray with just a trace of rose along the ridge of her spine. Her wings were not just folded. They were wrapped around her body like a shell, tips tucked under her belly, every edge pulled in as tight as it could go. Her eyes were closed, but she was not sleeping. The tension in her body was visible even from across the room. She was doing what prey animals do when they have given up trying to escape. She was making herself as small as possible and waiting for whatever came next. Rawl walked to the wall about 2 meters away from her and sat down on the floor. The floor was warm, of course it was. He crossed his legs, put his hands in his lap and looked at the far wall instead of at her. He could see her in his peripheral vision. She had not moved. Her wings were still pulled tight. He waited. He was by nature a patient man. His colleagues teased him about it sometimes. He was the one who would wait 40 minutes for a supply contact who was supposed to arrive in 10, without complaint, because losing that contact meant the medicine did not move, and the medicine needed to move. He was the one who filled out the same form 4 times when the system rejected it 3 times, without raising his voice. He was the one who, when a distribution route collapsed at hour 19 of a 20-hour shift, sat down with the local team and figured out the problem from the beginning again, quietly, until it was fixed. He was very good at not making things worse. He sat on the warm floor and looked at the far wall, and after a while he stopped tracking time. At some point the clicking trill sounds in the room changed. They became less frequent. Then they stopped. He could hear, without looking, the sounds of small bodies shifting, the rustle of scaled wings relaxing by tiny degrees. He did not look. He kept his eyes on the far wall and his hands in his lap and his breathing slow. He heard the first footstep maybe an hour in, small, tentative, coming from the right. Then another, then a pause, then a sound he could not quite identify, a kind of soft scraping, like claws finding purchase on a smooth surface. Then something small and very warm landed on his shoulder. He did not move. She was lighter than he expected and heavier than a bird. Her small claws found a grip on the fabric of his jacket, and he could feel the heat of her through the material, pressing into the skin of his shoulder like a warm compress. There was a moment, a single held breath of a moment, and then the tension went out of her all at once, the way tension does when something that has been held too tightly is finally allowed to let go. She put her head against the side of his neck. And she went asleep. Rahl sat there and looked at the far wall. His left shoulder was very hot. His legs had begun to ache. He did not move. An hour passed, then another. When Orath came to check on the sector at the shift's end, she opened the door and stopped. She looked at the scene for a long moment, the human sitting cross-legged on the floor, the small gray hatchling asleep on his shoulder, the other hatchlings spread around the room in various states of rest, calm in a way they had not been in 2 days, and she did not speak. She reached over and quietly turned off the entry light so it wouldn't disturb anything. Rahl sat there until Sira woke up on her own. He did not know then that what he had done had a name. He did not know that in Draconi culture, the act of holding stillness for a sleeping hatchling was older than their written language. He did not know that the Compact's translation databases would spend 6 hours failing to find a proper equivalent for the word that was already being used, in quiet exile transmissions across 3-star systems, to describe him. He just knew that she had been scared, and she had needed to sleep, and he had not wanted to make it worse. That was all. That was enough. Rumors in space travel differently than they do on planets. On a planet, a rumor moves through streets and markets and workplaces, and it changes shape as it goes. Details get added, details get dropped. The story that arrives at one end of a city is barely related to the one that started at the other. In space, between stations and ships and relay buoys scattered across light years of nothing, a rumor travels in short, compressed bursts of signal. It keeps its shape better. What gets transmitted tends to arrive the way it was sent. The message that went out from Station Meridian 2 days after Rahl sat on that floor was not an official communique. It was a private message from one of the junior station staff to a cousin working aboard a Draconi exile transport. It was 11 words long and included a badly recorded video clip from the sector's internal camera feed. Within 36 hours, that clip had been forwarded 412 times. Within 72 hours, it had been seen by the Draconi Elder Council in exile. The clip was not impressive to look at. The camera was angled poorly and the quality was low. It showed a human male sitting cross-legged on a floor, not doing anything for what appeared to be a very long time. At some point, a small gray shape climbed onto his shoulder. Then nothing happened for the rest of the clip because nothing was supposed to happen. That was the point. That was the thing that had been forwarded 412 times. The human did not move. Nari Abed found out about the clip the same way she found out about most problems. Someone forwarded it to her with a message that said only, "This is yours to deal with." Nari was Rahl's direct supervisor and had been managing humanitarian operations in compact space for 11 years. She was a practical woman who wore the same brand of sensible shoes in every posted photograph and had a filing system so organized that other department heads asked to tour it. She watched the clip twice, set it down, and spent about 4 minutes staring at the middle distance. Then she called Rahl. He answered from what sounded like a storage corridor. She could hear the hum of a refrigeration unit in the background. He was probably doing inventory. "Rahl," she said, "I need to ask you something directly." "All right. Did you know what you were doing in the hatchling sector? Did anyone brief you on Draconi culture? Did someone tell you what holding stillness would mean to them? There was a pause, not a guilty pause, just the pause of a man who was thinking carefully because the question deserved a careful answer. "No," he said, "nobody told me anything. She looked scared, and I didn't want to go over there and make it worse. So I sat down nearby and waited to see if she'd calm down, and then she climbed up and I didn't want to disturb her, so I stayed." Nari closed her eyes briefly. "Right," she said. "I'm sending you something to read. It's about Draconi customs. Please read it before you go back in there." She forwarded him 3 documents and then sat for a moment thinking about the Elder Council, which she already knew was asking for a full incident report. The Draconi were a species with very long memories and very precise cultural traditions, and what Rahl had stumbled into without knowing, without trying, was something called the Guardian Rest. It was not a greeting ritual. It was not a diplomatic gesture. It was the oldest form of trust expression in Draconi culture. An adult Draconi who held guardian rest for a sleeping hatchling was considered bound to that hatchling for life. Not legally, not politically, in a way that went much deeper than either of those things. No non-Draconi had ever performed it, not because it was forbidden, simply because no one outside the species had ever sat still enough, long enough, with no agenda to allow it to happen. The Elder Council's first message arrived that evening. It was addressed to Station Meridian's command authority and asked, in very careful, very formal language, for a full account of events in the hatchling quarantine sector on the date in question. The tone was the tone of someone who was quite sure they were about to be told they had been deceived, and wanted all the details in writing before they said so. Elder Voss was the one who had drafted it. He was the oldest surviving member of the council, a Draconi of advanced years whose scales had gone from deep amber to the pale gray that came with age, and who had spent 40 years watching other species make promises to the Draconi that turned out to mean nothing. He did not trust easily. He did not trust quickly. And he was quite certain that a human performing a guardian rest was either an accident or a manipulation, and either way he intended to find out which. Station Command forwarded the inquiry to Nari, who forwarded it to her director, who called Nari back and told her to handle it. She drafted a careful response that included the camera footage, the medical records showing the hatchling's change in condition, and a short factual account of what Rahl had done and why. She included, at the end, the transcript of her call with him. She did not editorialize. She let the 11 words do the work. "I just didn't want to go over there and make it worse." Elder Voss received the response on his exile cruiser, the Ashward, 3 days out from the station. He read the report. He watched the footage. He read the transcript. Then he listened to the audio of Rahl's call, not a transcript, the actual recorded audio 3 times. He said nothing to anyone for the rest of that day. Meanwhile, Ambassador Dreel of the Compact Liaison Office issued a statement noting that Station Meridian, a compact facility, had played an instrumental role in the cultural exchange moment now being discussed across the refugee networks. His office also quietly began drafting a proposal to establish a formal Compact Draconi Relations Committee, with the Compact in a supervisory role. Elder Voss responded to that statement in a single sentence, broadcast on open channel so that every ship in the region could hear it. The Compact did not sit still. A human did. These are not the same thing. Ambassador Dreel's office did not send a follow-up. In the exile networks, in the cramped transit ships and the crowded way station bunks where Draconi refugees slept in shifts, the conversation was different. It was quieter. It was the kind of conversation people have when they are turning something over slowly, looking at it from every angle, trying to decide if it is real. Someone had sat still, for hours, for no reason anyone could name except that a frightened child needed to sleep. There was an old Draconi word for that kind of person. The translation was rough, as translations of old words always are. The closest version in the common tongue was something like, "the ground that does not shift." They were saying it carefully in the exile ships in the way stations, not loudly, not officially. But they were saying it. The Galactic Compact Security Council met in a room designed to make everyone in it feel small. This was deliberate. The chamber had been built 300 years ago by the founding species, the Velasi, the Pelin, and the Korathi, who had decided, with the particular wisdom of people who have just finished a very long war, that no one should feel too comfortable when making decisions about violence. The ceiling was high and the lighting was cool, and the seats were arranged in a wide arc around a central floor space that no one ever stood in unless they had been formally called to speak. Everything about the room said, "Think carefully, what you say here has weight." Admiral Shen did not look like someone who needed a room to tell her that. She was a small woman, which people noticed first, because they expected someone different. She had short gray hair and the kind of posture that came not from training, but from a lifetime of meaning what she said. She had been the human representative to the Compact's military council for 4 years, and in those 4 years she had sat in this room many times, and she had never once been given the floor without having to ask for it twice. Today she had asked once. The debate was about the Vaughn. The Vaughn Armada had been moving steadily through the outer sectors for 8 months, taking worlds that could not defend themselves, and leaving behind the particular silence of places that no longer existed in any meaningful way. The Compact had 3 defensive fleets positioned at the edge of Draconi space. The question on the table was whether those fleets were enough, and whether, in the careful language that councils use when they mean something unpleasant, the human contingent should be given an expanded operational role. Most of the council members had opinions about humans that could be summarized in a single word: unpredictable. Humans were a young species. They had only been in compact space for 60 years. They were emotional, they were variable, and they had a troubling tendency to make decisions based on factors that did not fit neatly into any strategic model that anyone had yet developed. 3 separate compact analysts had tried to build predictive models for human behavior in combat situations. All 3 had eventually listed irrational persistence as an unquantifiable variable and stopped trying. Counselor Meth of the Velasi spoke first, as Velasi always did, because they had been founding members and they had not forgotten it. He said that human ships had been useful in supply operations, but that giving them a combat expansion was premature, given the lack of data on their performance in sustained engagements. Rahl did not know that at that moment across the station, the council was talking about his species. He was in the hatchling sector doing what he had done every day for the past 5 weeks. Sierra was on his shoulder. She was larger now. She had been eating steadily since that first night, and her pale gray scales had taken on a faint luster, the way scales do when a hatchling is healthy. She could not fly yet. Her wings were too small and not yet strong enough. But she moved around the sector with a confidence she had not had before, and she came back to Rahl's shoulder the way a person comes back to a chair they have decided is theirs. Back in the council chamber, Admiral Shen had been given the floor. She did not use a display. She did not show charts. She stood on the central floor that no one stood on unless formally called, and she said, "I would like to talk about the supply runs." For the past 8 months, human cargo ships had been running supply lines through the outer sectors, the same sectors that the Vaughn were moving through. These routes were considered extremely dangerous. Every non-human carrier that had attempted them had factored in an expected loss rate, a percentage of ships and crew that were simply accepted as the cost of doing business in contested space. The Compact's own models suggested a loss rate of between 12 and 18% on those routes. The human loss rate was 1.3%. Shen let that number sit in the room for a moment. "We've been asked," she said, "how we achieve that. The answer is that we do not have a target loss rate. We go in assuming that everyone comes back and we plan from that assumption. We run more ships than the model says we need. We run more communications relays. We do not call a route clear until we have confirmation from every vessel on it. We do not leave the last ship waiting. We do not move on until everyone has moved on. Counselor Meth said that this sounded inefficient. It is, Shen said. It costs more, it takes longer, and the loss rate is 1.3%. There was a pause. The math is not the point, she said. The point is what we are calculating for. You calculate for acceptable losses. We calculate for total return. Those are different problems and they produce different results. No one spoke for a moment. The cool light of the chamber made everyone look very still. Rawl at that moment was reading to the hatchlings. He had started doing this a week ago, not because anyone told him to, but because Sierra seemed to like it. He could not tell if she understood the words. He suspected she liked the sound more than the meaning, the rhythm of it, the steadiness. He was reading from an old book about a man who built a boat and waited out a flood, which was perhaps not the most cheerful story for refugees. But the cadence was slow, and Even and the hatchlings had started gathering nearby when he sat down with it, which seemed like a good sign. The council, by the end of the session, had not reached a formal decision. But two things had shifted in the room, quietly, in the way that things shift when an idea enters a space and cannot be unentered. The first was that Counselor Meth had stopped using the word unpredictable and had started using the word consistent. These are very different words, and the change was not accidental. The second happened at the end of the session, when the council chamber was mostly empty, and Rawl had been called in as a civilian witness on the hatchling care situation. He was sitting in the observer section with Sierra on his shoulder. She had refused to be left behind and he had not argued with her. The chamber was in informal recess. Sierra looked at the open floor space where Admiral Shen had stood, tilted her small head, then walked down Rawl's arm, crossed the floor of the compact Security Council, and climbed into Rawl's lap where he sat in the front observer row. She went asleep. In Draconi culture, what she had just done was a public declaration. She had walked an open space before witnesses and chosen her person. She had named him in the oldest way her species knew how. Every Draconi who reviewed the chamber footage later would understand immediately what it meant. Elder Voss, watching on a delayed feed from the Ashward, sat for a long time without speaking. Then he made one call to his military commander and said 4 words. Fly with the humans. Voan had a word for the moment a target stopped resisting. It translated, roughly, as the opening. Their entire military doctrine was built around finding that moment and pressing into it before it closed. They were very good at this. They had been doing it for 200 years, across 40 worlds, and in that time they had learned to read the signs with great precision. The slight backward drift of a defense line, the reallocation of ships from forward positions to rear support, the change in communication patterns that came when a command structure began planning for retreat rather than resistance. These were the sounds of an opening. The Vaughn were very good at hearing them. They did not hear them at Meridian. The probe attack came in 3 waves, which was standard Vaughn procedure. The first wave was not meant to win anything. It was meant to measure. You sent in a small force, watched how the defense responded, identified where it was soft, and pulled back to plan the main push. The first wave hit the outer perimeter of Station Meridian at 3:40 station time, on a shift rotation that the Vaughn's intelligence suggested would have the lowest human alert response. Admiral Shen was already awake. She had not been awake because of the intelligence failure, though that was noted later with some interest. She had been awake because of a supply manifest that had been logged incorrectly 2 days ago and had only been caught by a routine cross-check, and she had been working with her logistics team to reroute 3 cargo vessels before the window closed. She had been doing this for 4 hours before the first Vaughn signatures appeared on the long-range sensors. She set down the manifest and said, very calmly to her communications officer, "Sound general readiness. Don't panic the station. Just get everyone to their positions." The defense that formed around Station Meridian in the next 20 minutes was not the kind of defense that made good footage. It was not dramatic. There were no speeches. Ships moved into positions that looked, to outside observers, like they were drawing in rather than pushing out, tightening a shell around the station rather than spreading into an attack formation. The first Vaughn wave hit this formation and found it harder than expected and withdrew to report. Inside the station, Rawl was already in the hatchling sector. He had gone there not because anyone told him to, but because the station's alert sound, a low, cycling tone that was designed to be informative without being frightening, had the opposite effect on species who did not know what it meant. The hatchlings were agitated. Several were clicking and trilling in the high register that meant distress. One had begun packing, which was a bad sign in a space this small. Rawl came in, sat down on the floor and started talking. He did not tell them everything was fine. He was not that kind of person. He said that there were some ships nearby that should not be there, and that the people whose job it was to handle that were handling it, and that the best thing the hatchlings could do was stay in this room and be calm. He said this in the slow, even voice he used when he was reading to them, because the voice was the important part, not the words. Sierra came to his shoulder immediately. Outside, the second Vaughn wave was larger. This was also standard procedure. You sent twice what the first wave meant, because a defense line that was still intact after one probe was either stronger than it looked or operating on fear, and you needed to know which. If it was fear, the second wave would find the opening. If it was not fear, you would learn that too, which was also useful information. The second wave hit the defense shell around Meridian, and the shell did not move. Ships were damaged. One human frigate lost its forward section entirely, and the remaining crew sealed off and held position with emergency thrusters. Two more came up from reserve to bracket it. The line compressed. It did not drift. It did not reallocate to the rear. It made no sounds in its communications patterns that resembled the sounds of an opening. Commander Bryn, leading the Draconi exile vessels that had joined the defense 3 days ago, called Admiral Shen on a direct channel. "We should go out," she said. "Hit their flanks, break their formation before the third wave." "No," Shen said. "They're massing for a third push, if we strike now." "If we strike now, we thin the shell," Shen said. "The station is what we're defending. The station does not move. We do not move." Bryn was quiet for a moment. She was a combat officer. Every instinct she had said attack, because attack was what you did when the enemy was still organizing. Waiting felt like surrendering ground she hadn't lost yet. "What are we doing?" she asked. "We're making them pay," Shen said, "for every meter of us." She meant it literally. The Vaughn third wave was the largest, full commitment, the kind of attack that was supposed to shatter whatever was left after 2 probes had softened it. It hit the shell at Meridian, and the shell held, and held, and held, and did not open, and the cost of pushing against it kept going up, and the Vaughn command structure began to hear something it did not have a word for. The opposite of an opening. Inside, Rawl was reading. Hull impacts made the station shudder every few minutes, low and deep, like distant thunder. The hatchlings had learned to expect them now and flinched less with each one. Sierra's small claws gripped his shoulder tighter when the big ones hit, but she did not move from her position, and neither did he. He was reading the part about the water receding, which he had always thought was the most important part of that old story, not the flood itself, but the waiting after. The part where the man on the boat did not know how long it would take, and could not know, and waited anyway. When the Draconi exile fleet came out of transit, it was 40 minutes earlier than scheduled. Commander Bryn had reported this to Admiral Shen with a brief explanation. Elder Voss had personally ordered the acceleration. The ships came out of transit at an angle that caught the Vaughn third wave between the defense shell and the new arrivals, which is a very bad position to be caught in. The Vaughn retreated. It was not a fighting retreat. It was the other kind. The kind that happens when something you thought would open does not open no matter how hard you push, and the cost of continuing to push becomes something that cannot be justified. In 200 years, the Vaughn had never done it before. Shen logged the outcome in her report with the same flat language she used for everything. Third Vaughn offensive wave engaged and repelled, station intact, personnel accounted for, supply rerouting resumed. She sent the manifest correction to her logistics team and told them to finish it by morning. In the hatchling sector, the alert tone stopped. The room got quieter. Several of the hatchlings, exhausted from hours of tension, were already asleep in a pile in the corner. Sierra was asleep on Ra's shoulder. He was still sitting on the floor, back against the wall, book closed in his lap, doing what he was good at. Not moving, not making it worse. Waiting for the water to go down. Nobody told the compact the ceremony was happening. That was deliberate. Elder Voss had spent 40 years watching the compact take things that did not belong to it, credit, territory, cultural significance, and reframe them as products of its own management. He had watched the compact absorb moments of genuine meaning and turn them into diplomatic currency. He was not going to let that happen here. So he sent his message directly to Station Meridian's command, listed the date and time, said that the Elder Council would be arriving in person, and noted that compact liaison personnel were welcome to observe but not to speak. Ambassador Dreel sent 3 messages asking for a planning meeting. Voss did not reply to any of them. Rahl found out about the ceremony the same way he found out about most things that were happening to him. Nari called. "There is going to be a ceremony," she said, "for you." "For me," he repeated, in the tone of a man who has just been told something he doesn't have a category for. "Elder Voss is coming to the station. The whole Elder Council is coming. It is apparently a significant cultural event." "What kind of ceremony?" Nari paused. She had the file open in front of her. "It's called the Bond Name Ceremony. It's the oldest formal tradition in Draconi culture. They are going to give you a name." "I have a name." "A Draconi name. A permanent one. One that stays in their records. Forever." She paused again. "Rahl, the last time this was done for someone outside their species was 314 years ago, and that recipient was a Pellan elder who spent 20 years in diplomatic service to the Draconi people. You sat on a floor." There was a silence on the line. "I was doing my job," Rahl said. "I know you were. Just please wear something that doesn't have supply manifest ink on it." The main hall of Station Meridian had been designed for practical purposes: large gatherings, cargo briefings, emergency assemblies. It was not beautiful. It had the exposed pipe aesthetic of a building that had been built quickly and then added to several times by people with different ideas. But the Draconi contingent had arrived the night before and had done something to the hall quietly, without announcement. By morning, there were long strips of dark fabric hung at precise intervals from the ceiling, the color of deep water, and on the floor in front of the speaking position, there was a mark burned into the metal in a pattern Rahl did not recognize, but which Oreth later told him was older than any star chart in the compact's database. The hall filled slowly. Station staff, medical personnel, a few compact representatives who had been told they could observe. The Draconi exile community on the station, those who had arrived in the weeks since the evacuation, filled the left side of the hall in a silence that felt very full rather than very empty. Many of them had hatchlings with them. The hatchlings were calm in a way that Rahl recognized, because it was the same calm that had slowly filled the quarantine sector over weeks of slow work. Sierra was on his shoulder. She was not small anymore. She was still young, still a juvenile, still without full flight capability, but she had grown considerably, and she was now large enough that sitting on a human shoulder required some mutual negotiation. She had arrived at an arrangement where her front half draped over his shoulder and her back half pressed against his back, her tail curled loosely around his arm. She had worked this out herself. He had simply held still while she figured it out. Elder Weiss entered the hall last. He was very old. His scales had gone the pale gray that Rahl associated with age now, having learned it from Sierra's own coloring, which was different. Sierra's gray was the gray of a hatchling who had not yet found her permanent color. Voss's gray was the gray of amber that had faded slowly over a very long time. He moved with the deliberate care of someone who understood how much each movement cost and was willing to pay it, and he carried a staff not for ceremony, but because he needed it. He stood in front of the mark on the floor and looked at Rahl for a long moment. Rahl looked back. He was standing where Nari had told him to stand, wearing the jacket without the manifest ink. Sierra was doing her shoulder drape arrangement. He was not quite sure what his expression was supposed to be doing, and had settled on the expression he used when he was waiting for a supply contact, present calm, not going anywhere. Voss spoke in Draconi first. It was a long account, ceremonial in structure, the kind of speech that carried weight because of how long it was as much as what it said. The translation was being rendered in real time by the station's system, but Rahl listened to the Draconi rather than the translation, because the sound of it was something he wanted to pay attention to. It sounded like the language of people who had been speaking for a very long time, who had worn smooth all the unnecessary parts and kept only what mattered. Then Voss switched to the common tongue, and he looked at Rahl directly. "You sat still," he said, "so she could sleep." He said it simply, the way a statement of fact is said, not the way a compliment is delivered. "In our tongue," Voss continued, "that is not a small thing. An adult of our kind cannot do what you did. Our bodies run too hot. Our instincts run too loud. We cannot offer the stillness a hatchling needs in their worst moment. We have always known this as a limitation of what we are. We did not know it was something another kind of person could give." He paused. The hall was very quiet. The strips of dark fabric moved slightly in the ventilation current. "We have a word," Voss said, "for the one who holds still, for the one who sits on the cold ground in a warm room with no reason to stay except that leaving would make things worse." He looked at Rahl steadily. "In our oldest records, that word is sacred. It predates our written language. It belongs to the foundation of what we believe a person can be." He took one step forward, which for a man using a staff was a significant gesture. "The ground that does not shift," he said, "that is what we call you, now and in all our records for as long as we keep them." Sierra lifted her head from Rahl's shoulder. She looked at Voss. Then she looked at the room. Then she did something she had not been told to do because no one had told her to do anything. She stepped deliberately down Rahl's arm, stood in the open space before Elder Voss and bowed her head. It was a Draconi gesture of recognition, of confirmation. She was telling them, "Yes, this is the one. I have already given my answer." Voss looked at her for a long moment, and something moved in his old face that was not quite emotion and not quite pride, and was possibly both. The hall was silent. Then Nari, from somewhere in the crowd, made a sound that was mostly a cough but was possibly something else, and the silence broke gently, and people began to breathe normally again. Outside, through the station's observation panels, the stars were the same as they always were, cold and steady and very far away. But in the compact's transmission networks, something was moving. Analysts in a dozen species intelligence services were pulling up records they had not looked at closely before. Supply run statistics, battle logs, small moments caught in station camera footage. They were adding them up, one by one, and arriving at a sum that did not look like anything they had expected when they first started paying attention to the species from the small blue planet at the edge of compact space. Nobody had told the compact the ceremony was happening. But the compact had seen it anyway, and what it had seen was going to take a long time to fully understand. Rahl walked back to the hatchling sector afterward, because it was feeding time and someone needed to be there. Sierra went with him. She was on his shoulder, large and warm and steady, and she put her head against the side of his neck the same way she had the first night, and she made a sound low in her chest that the translation systems had no word for. He didn't need a word for it. He already knew what it meant. The Vaughn shuttle was small and gray, and it arrived without an escort. That was the first unusual thing. Vaughn ships always traveled in formation, a lead vessel surrounded by a minimum of 4 support craft, because traveling alone was, in Vaughn thinking, an invitation to be treated as prey. The fact that the shuttle came alone was either a mistake or a statement, and the Vaughn did not make mistakes in formation protocol. It was a statement. The station the meeting was held on was called Waypoint 14. It was 3 months after the battle at Meridian, and the Vaughn had not pushed again into that sector in all that time, which was itself unusual enough to have generated 17 separate intelligence reports from 6 different compact agencies, all of which concluded with some variation of cause unclear. Waypoint 14 was neutral ground, a small, unglamorous station that processed long-haul cargo and had exactly 1 meeting room large enough to hold 8 people, which was 1 more than the number that would be present today. Rahl arrived with Nari, one compact observer who had been told firmly that she was there to listen and not to speak, and Sierra. Sierra had not been part of the original request. The Vaughn had asked, very specifically, for the human from the footage. They had described him in their message not by name but by what he had done, the one who remained still. The Compact's diplomatic office had assumed they meant Admiral Shen, which said a great deal about what the Compact's diplomatic office paid attention to. When the correction came, accompanied by a still image from the quarantine sector camera, featuring a man sitting cross-legged on a floor with a small gray shape on his shoulder. There had been a long internal discussion about whether sending an aid logistics worker to meet with the Vaughn was appropriate. Nari had ended the discussion by pointing out that the Vaughn had specified who they wanted, and that arguing with a species that had just agreed to a meeting after 40 years of silence was perhaps not the best diplomatic strategy. Sierra came because Sierra went where Rahl went. She was large now, large enough that the shoulder arrangement had evolved. She stood beside him rather than on him when she was being formal, which she had somehow learned was a distinct mode from their private time. She stood beside him now in the corridor outside the meeting room, her head level with his shoulder, her wings folded in the careful way that meant she was paying attention. The Vaughn speaker arrived with 2 guards who stopped at the door. The speaker entered alone. Rahl had read everything the Compact's database had on Vaughn physical appearance, and the database had been accurate as far as it went: tall, broad, with a gray-blue cast to their skin, and eyes set wide on a face that did not produce the same range of expression that most species use to communicate. What the database had not conveyed was how still they could be. The speaker stood across the table from Rahl and was, for a moment, extremely still in a way that felt like assessment. Then the speaker's eyes moved to Sierra. Sierra returned the look steadily. She did not move either. This went on for several seconds, 2 large beings looking at each other with the careful attention of individuals who were trying to decide what they were dealing with. Then the speaker sat down. Slowly, the way a person sits when they are choosing to make themselves smaller, not because they have to, but because they are deciding to. The guard posture outside the door relaxed. Rahl noticed this but did not comment on it. Nari's counterpart, a Vaughn logistics official who had been introduced briefly and not spoken since, opened a document on the table surface and then left it closed. This was also a statement. The speaker looked at Rahl and said, in compact standard that was careful and precise and clearly studied, "Why did you not move?" Rahl had been thinking about this question since Nari told him it was coming. He had thought about it seriously, the way he thought about supply problems, not looking for the answer that sounded best, but looking for the answer that was true. He said, "Because she needed the sleep more than I needed to be comfortable." The speaker was quiet for a moment. Outside, very faintly, the sound of a cargo bay cycling. "This is the whole answer?" the speaker asked. "Yes." Another pause. Rahl waited. He was good at that. "We were given reports," the speaker said, "about human behavior in military contexts. The report said humans fight because you attach value to territory, that you persist in defense because you fear loss of ground." Rahl thought about this. "That might be true sometimes," he said, "but I don't think it's the main reason." "What is the main reason?" Rahl looked at Sierra for a moment and then back at the speaker. "We don't like leaving people behind. We're not very good at deciding that someone isn't worth the effort. We just keep going because the other option is leaving something behind, and we're not built for that." The speaker was quiet for longer this time. "We were told," the speaker said finally, "that humans are like us, that you move through space to acquire, that you expand because expansion is the nature of a successful species." The speaker's wide eyes did not blink, which was normal for Vaughn but gave the next words a particular weight. "We were told wrong." Nari did not move. The compact observer did not move. Nobody in the room moved because moving felt like it might interrupt something important. "At Meridian," the speaker continued, "we pushed 3 times. In 200 years we have never failed to find the opening. What you defended was not territory. You were defending the station, the hatchlings, the people inside." A pause. "You were not trying to win, you were trying to bring them home." "Yes," Rahl said. "This is different," the speaker said. "From territory, from acquisition. This is," the speaker paused, working with the language. "This does not have a word in our tongue. We have words for what we understand. We do not have a word for this." Elder Voss, listening on audio from somewhere far away, said nothing. The meeting lasted 3 more hours. It was not a peace treaty. It was not a formal negotiation. It was, more than anything else, a conversation, the speaker asking questions and Rahl answering them as honestly as he could, and occasionally Sierra doing something that the speaker watched with a focused attention that was hard to read but did not look hostile. Near the end, the speaker asked, "The young one, she chose you?" "Yes." "Why?" Rahl thought about the first night, the warm floor, the far wall, the hours of sitting still with nothing to offer except the fact of not leaving. "I don't know exactly," he said. "I think she was scared and I was nearby and I didn't do anything frightening. Sometimes that's enough." The speaker looked at him for a long time. Then the speaker said, "We would like to understand your species better before we make any further decisions about you." It was the most significant sentence spoken in compact diplomatic space in 40 years, and it was said to an aid logistics worker in a meeting room with exposed pipe fittings and a coffee machine that had been out of order since the previous Tuesday. Rahl said, "That seems reasonable." The shuttle left Waypoint 14 2 hours later, still alone, still without an escort. In the compact's intelligence networks, this was immediately flagged and debated and analyzed. 6 new reports were started. 3 conferences were scheduled. Elder Voss, who was still listening on audio, waited until the room had mostly cleared before he spoke. His voice came through the small speaker at the table's edge. Dry and quiet and deeply tired in the way of someone who has been right about something for a long time and does not find being right particularly satisfying. "It seems," he said, "that even the Vaughn can be curious when the alternative is being wrong about the ground beneath their feet." Rahl walked back to the shuttle dock with Sierra beside him. She was large enough now to walk with him properly, head level with his shoulder, wings folded, claws quiet on the floor. He had his hands in his pockets and was thinking about the supply run that needed to be rerouted before Thursday, and whether the refrigeration unit in Sector C was actually fixed or just intermittently functional, which was a different thing entirely. He was not thinking about what he had changed. He did not have a clean sense of it, and might not for a long time, because the people who quietly hold the ground in place are often the last to understand that the ground was ever in danger of shifting. Sierra made a sound low in her chest as they walked. He did not need a translation for it. He had known what it meant since the first night, when a small, frightened thing had climbed to his shoulder and trusted the stillness of him. It meant, "I am here. You are here. This is enough." The stars outside the observation panel were cold and steady, the way they always were, very old, very far away, patient in the way that only things that have been there forever can be patient. He walked on, she walked beside him. The ground did not shift.